Welcome back for the next session. Before I start the introduction to my friend Frank Dunn, there is an announcement that I will make again about the next year's convention. The next year's convention is, note the dates, 25, 26 November next year, same place, same organization. The price will be the same as this year, £85. But if you book now, you get £10 off. That's €15. Well, that's worthwhile. If you want to use this offer, go to praise.in and they will book it. After having done this, it's my pleasure to introduce Frank van Dunn, my friend, for many, many years. Frank and I worked in the beginning of the Dutch and Belgian libertarian movement, and Frank was also our wise advisor. If there was a problem, you always would ask Frank, and Frank knows the libertarian solution, how you do this, what you do with the poor, with the roads, all the things. You can't mention it that he knows. Frank is a professor of law, philosophy of law, in the University of Kent, and he also taught or teaches in Maastricht, in Dutch University. And he has written a lot of things. You can see that on the program. I'm not going to read it, you can do that yourself. But I missed one of the things, and that's one of the nature books that I use, and what I learned a lot of, that is the fundamental principle of law. It's a book, it's only in Dutch now, but it should be translated into English because it's really the fundament of all the libertarian things. And I won't take much more time because you are in for a treat by Frank.
Okay, thank you very much for these very kind words, also very challenging words, because I don't think I have the answers to all your questions. But, well, my topic today is the question of corporate capitalism, if you will, but beyond that, the very idea of sharing the world with corporate persons. Now, this thing is an old problem with me because my philosophical background is in what you may call the natural law tradition, except that I have a rather homemade brand of natural law thinking, because the central notion of law, or the basic notion of law that I use, is that of order. So law means order, and the natural part in natural law, or natural order, comes from the fact that we are talking about the order of natural persons. And once you have this idea of natural law as the order of human persons, natural persons, then of course we have a closed system, because we're all human, natural persons. But if you then introduce artificial persons, which is what you do when you talk about corporations, then you have to be very careful. If these artificial persons are introduced merely as tools of a kind or instruments of a kind, then of course there is no great theoretical problem. But if they are introduced, as it were, on a par with natural persons, as persons in their own right, then you get into very big trouble. Certainly for the libertarian thinkers, especially for the so-called anarcho-capitalist thinkers, because there is a world of difference between anarcho-capitalism and anarcho-corporate capitalism. And point that I'd like to bring up here is the one I made a couple of years ago in a footnote. And this footnote somehow called a lot of attention, and it is because of that footnote that I'm really here. So I'll read the last sentence of that footnote, if you permit me. As for leaving aside the ahistorical nature of the argument about corporate capitalism, that is the argument made, for example, by Norman Barry in his books on business ethics, as for the ahistorical nature of the argument and its complete disregard for the legal, political, and sociological factors of corporate development, it is far from clear that large corporations can be seen as conforming to the requirements of national law. Now, this was just one sentence in a footnote, but a lot of people asked me to expand on that idea, and I did that in a very short text in the Ideas for Liberty, edited by Sheldon Richmond for the Foundation of Economic Education. And as a result, I got a lot of people urging me to write more about it, and also some a lot of mail from people urging me to shut up about it, because this is basically cranky and nutty and so on. And because of these two different reactions, it is clear that there is a sort of tension at the very heart of libertarian thinking. And it's basically, I think, tension between those who have a property-based approach to liberty or libertarianism, and those who have a contract-based approach to libertarianism. And the idea of freedom of contract is indeed the one that is most often invoked by people who defend corporate capitalism as being completely in accordance with the notions of the libertarian philosophy. And the reason, or rather the main argument for that has been spelled out some time ago, towards the end of the 1970s, by Robert Hessen in a book called In Defense of the Corporation. And I will say some words about the book by Hessen in a moment, but I'd like to address first the question of corporations as such, and then the more cultural problems that libertarians may have with corporations. Now, one of the items of contention in the discussion about corporations is that those who defended the notion of the corporation basically argue that there is nothing wrong with limited liability shareholders. And of course, there is nothing wrong with limited liability shareholders, unless you then add that the shareholders are the owners of the corporation, because then you end up with the notion of limited liability owners of something. And ownership that is limited by nature, as it were, intrinsically limited ownership, is of course a notion that is not one should readily accept. But then if you turn to people like myself, that in the meantime, and quite by coincidence, there has been another argument made against corporate capitalism from a classical liberal point of view rather than a libertarian one, by Piet van Egen, a Dutch economist writing from South Africa at the moment, who in the last issue of the Journal of Libertarian Studies published a critique of the corporate form, in which he, like myself, took his main aim not at limited liability shareholders, because that is not the problem, but at the problem of corporate personality. Right? And the discussion then is between those who say there is nothing wrong with limited liability shareholding, and I agree with that, but who then interpret it in a rather different frame by saying the shareholders are the owners of the corporation. But if you look at the corporation and its shareholders, it is very difficult to identify the shareholders with the owners of something because of their very limited liabilities and their very limited rights, decision-making rights in the corporation. And on the other hand, you have those who attack the corporate form as such. And as I noticed, once we have a world with artificial persons next to natural persons, you have to be very clear where your priorities are. And it is very easy, if you have the sort of Robert Hessen freedom of contract approach, to see corporate persons as entities in their own right, and then say, well, that's no problem because the owners are the shareholders. The argument, as I will try to show, is a contradiction in terms, but let me first return to the corporate form itself. As I noticed, corporate personality is, especially in questions of corporate businesses, the business corporation is a very contentious idea, and it was a contentious idea when it was introduced in the 19th century. But corporations are, of course, much older than the 19th century business corporation. And in fact, the corporate form is the state. The state is the basic corporate form, and the state has been the model of the corporation ever since the personal property approach of rulership was abandoned. At the moment the king, as it were, becomes an office holder rather than the owner of the realm, at that moment we have the corporate entity in a sense. The church, of course, was also a corporate structure, and it's very remarkable that in history corporations, as it were, grow with the state. And when the modern state originated in the 16th century, very soon you saw the first non-political corporations or semi-political corporations develop in the form of, for example, the big trading companies, the East India companies in the Netherlands and in England and so on. Then you had a form of corporation that should touch a nerve among libertarians, central banks, also corporate institutions, in their way, fractional reserve banking, also for the greater part of their history, for the greater part of their number, corporate forms, of course organized within the monetary system as time went by, more and more. And then finally in the mid-19th century, you had the reinvention of the state, as it were, as a democratic corporation, where the state was a sort of anonymous association, société anonyme, to use the French word, where all the positions were held by officers or managers, and a sort of shareholders, the citizens, who had occasional voting rights in a general assembly of the electorate. Now, when this transformation of the state occurred very rapidly, you had the adoption of general incorporation laws for businesses. And I remember from my student days when a corporation law was introduced the first time in the curriculum in my studies, the professor at that time said, well, these laws make sure that the corporate form in business is the same sort of democracy we have in the state. So the legal terminology, the legal view of the business corporation was that it should be a sort of democratic society, complete with its voters and its managers and so on. Now, the history of the corporate form has been very successful, and one may have various views of it. The standard view in the literature is that the corporate form is successful because it is so efficient. So it beats the competition, as it were. But another explanation can be that the corporate form is so successful because it has certain advantages, not a greater efficiency, but that it removes a number of liabilities. This is a particular case with the limited liability corporation, which, as it were, allows the corporate or organizations that have corporate form, corporate personality, to, as it were, disperse the risks of their actions so that they have to be carried wherever they fall. They are not, as it were, automatically trained or traced back to the origin within the organization. As a result of the success of the corporate form, we have in the 20th century what may be called a corporate culture, a society of corporations with corporate culture. And I think this culture by itself should have some, should generate some questions among liberals, classical liberals and libertarians. Because if you look at corporations, especially the larger corporations, of course, which are the flagships of the corporate world, the state in the first place, but also now the large business corporations, monetary, financial corporations, and so on. These are very large, hierarchical organizations. And you have a lot of people today, probably here in the room, who spend most of their time working in and with corporations. So they are very much attuned to the cultural environment of the corporation, which, again, is very much a hierarchical setting. So it is a setting in which you have to know your place, basically. You are not the equal and a free person, because you act from within a position. And this positional thinking, where you have to know your place, and the rule book that comes with your place, and also the rule book that comes with the place of the person opposite you, this is not the sort of environment in which you have the free interaction of free and equal persons. Or freedom, the classical notion of freedom, all the principles of law, natural law, principles of justice, are derived from the interaction between free and equal persons. Everything that we have as notions of justice are based on that general playing field. You meet another person and he's just the same as you. But if you are in organizations with large and developed hierarchies and very special positions, you get the idea that you cannot talk to a person unless you know perfectly well where he sits in the organization, what his competence is, what his authority is, and so on. Now, you have the phenomenon of the corporate man, the corporate person, someone who is very much attuned to that sort of environment. And I doubt very much if such a person is, as it were, a natural for freedom. Because this is not, if you train that sort of life, if you feel very comfortable in that sort of environment, then you may not have the sort of automatic instincts that you expect people to have, as you say, to freedom, personal freedom. Now, when Huub said at the beginning that I had all the answers to his questions, of course that is an exaggeration very much, but the truth in it is that I always try to solve problems assuming that there is no hierarchy.
Yes.
And that is the big difficulty. Now, once you have the idea that, well, if you can't solve it, ask someone higher up in the hierarchy, then of course you are, as it were, abandoning your principles. So my approach always was to look at the solution, assuming that there was no hierarchy, no God and no master, so to speak. Now, in the corporate world, corporate organizations, the manager also is a very important figure. And the manager, of course, is someone who gives commands. It is useless to have a manager if there is no one to take his commands. So again, you have this a world with people who are, as it were, in the military mode, command and obey mode, rather than the speak and respond mode. And with the managerial component, you get all the problems that arise from the passing the buck, the vicarious responsibility, vicarious liability questions. Respondeat superior, that's the doctrine. I'm just doing my job, ask the boss, talk to the boss, talk to my superior. So you have a lot of people who assume that what they are doing is not their own responsibility. And it is nice to know that it's always somebody up there who will answer the questions. That is not a culture in which freedom comes naturally. Now, I only lived in a small part of the 20th century, but sometimes when I read older literature, I have the feeling that until the later part of the 19th century at least, this freedom thinking was much more natural to people than it is today, at least among the people that I know. I'm a city boy, living among people, most of them who work for corporations, whether they're universities or the state or big corporations. But the sort of response that people have today, without not any ideological setting, right, but just the common responses today, they are not really very much libertarian-minded, freedom-minded from the heart. It's, as it were, an intellectual exercise rather than a spontaneous reaction. And I think that has a lot to do with the prevalence of the corporate form, which, by the way, starts early in life, as we are all taken to school at a very early age and put in big organizations where respondeat superior goes all the way up to the central ministry. Now, we have this culture of corporations, and I don't think it's very suitable for libertarian thinking or for libertarian acting. But still, that may be just a consequence that we have to take. The question is the logical one: are corporations compatible with principles of free market capitalism if you approach these from a broadly national law basis? Hessen dismisses the idea that the corporation is not compatible, and he dismisses not compatible with free market capitalism, and he dismisses that notion with the argument that every single feature of the corporation can be recreated by contract. Right? That is the basic argument he makes. But, as I indicated at the beginning, he backs down from one aspect, namely the notion that the corporation is separate from natural persons. That is why he says the corporation should not be seen as a separate entity. The separate entity notion of the corporation is a useless, invalid concept. Why? Well, he says, if you have a separate corporate personality, then you end up with obvious injustices. And the injustices that he mentions are the one person or one man corporation and the closed corporation. And why are these injustice? Because they are, as it were, masks that the person uses, right, to hide his personal action behind a corporate veil. And the corporate veil allows him to restrict himself, his own liability. So it is as if I were tattooing the letters LLP on my forehead, limited liability person, and because I have these letters tattooed on my forehead, everything I do is the responsibility of my public persona, and I have, say, 5 gold grams assets for my public persona. So all my liabilities are restricted to 5 gold grams. And I can do whatever I want. If somebody sues me, I say, sorry, it's not me you want, it's my corporation. So that's obviously unjust. But the argument that Hessen has against the one-person corporation, of course, is not about the fact that it is one person hiding behind the veil. Why is one-person corporation obviously unjust and a two-person corporation obviously just? Merely because they had a contract? That's a bit stretching the notion of validation by contract. So somewhere along the line, he switches from an obviously unjust one-person corporation to an obviously just giant corporation. But in the meantime, he makes another rather remarkable switch to the argument. That is where he says, well, the one-person corporation is obviously unjust because it allows a person to hide, or as it were, to restrict his liability. And that would be a bad thing for his creditors, especially people who were harmed by him and sought redress for the harm he did to them. But, and this is the argument Hessen makes, this is not a problem for the giant corporation, because the giant corporation has enough assets or enough insurance to cover all these problems. But that is shifting the argument, because the argument that he makes is now based on a distinction between corporations that have sufficient assets or sufficient insurance and corporations that do not have sufficient assets and insurance. That is, at least conceptually and perhaps also empirically, another classification than the classification of one-person corporations and giant corporations. So he is, as it were, switching the logic of the argument. The logic of the argument is, for Hessen, giant corporations have enough insurance, therefore they are justified. But of course, that is not an argument proving that giant corporations are compatible with the principles of free market capitalism, which is what he set out to do. So Hessen, as it were, comes up empty-handed. It does not provide an argument for the compatibility of corporations with the free market. Especially, of course, when we press his argument on insurance, liability insurance, and then we see that his argument basically is a circular one. Because who insures the limited liability corporation? Just another limited liability corporation. Because the insurance companies today, with a few well-known exceptions, or at least one exception based in the city, I believe, almost all the large insurers are limited liability corporations. But you can hardly justify the limited liability corporation by saying that they are well insured by limited liability corporations. So where does the argument lead? Well, it leads Hessen, in fact, to argue, and this is the final point I'd like to discuss, it leads him to argue that liability should always be, it's quite obvious of course, should always be divided into contractual liability, liability arising out of contracts, and liability for torts or for any action not covered by contracts. And he says for liability for torts as well, for non-contractual debts, that liability should be assigned by law or in principle to the managers, to the officers of the corporation. But that, unfortunately, contradicts his own notion that the corporation is founded on contract. Because the managers are people who enter into a contract with the corporation. You go to work as a manager for a company, maybe even the CEO, on the basis of a contract. And there is no reason why this corporation manager contract should stipulate that the manager has all responsibility. In fact, the manager will probably insist that there will be limited liability for his actions. And for the same reason, shareholders, we are probably all shareholders here in one way or another, we would insist, okay, you can have some of my capital, but since I will not be involved with the running of the corporation, I will not accept liability. Shareholders and managers are bound to the corporation by contracts that explicitly mention their limited liability. So how can Hessen and his followers argue that people are free to contract and then say, well, regardless of their contracts, the officers of the corporation are liable? Now, why does he and so many other people arrive in this conundrum of relations? I think very simply because they never get to ask seriously the question that should be the very first question liberals and libertarians should ask, namely, who owns the corporation? And the ownership of the corporation. This is the vital question. Now, how do we ascertain ownership? Well, we do not pluck it out of thin air. Ownership is established by historical investigation. So if you want to look for the owners of the corporation, you have to go through the history of the corporation, to the founders. Because if there was an owner at all, then that owner was in the first place the founder of the corporation. And that was the central figure in all the contracts that eventually led to the corporation. So the corporate form should be seen as a tool that people use, but being a tool, it cannot achieve personality of its own. It will always be a tool of someone, and that someone is the owner. Now, if that person may manage, that person may be the main shareholder, but as soon as there are shareholder and manager contracts, then of course the owner conceptually, conceivably, is different from the managers and the shareholders. Now, unfortunately, we live in a world in which for maybe 100 years or more, the notion of looking for the owner of the corporation has, as it were, been dispelled from our minds. We have a purely formalistic approach, a paper approach to corporations rather than the historical question, who owns it? Just as we no longer ask, who owns the state? Right? We have this giant political corporation, and whenever something happens, politicians say, well, we're just the managers, okay, I'll resign, but don't ask me for any refunds. Right? And the same with the citizens, shareholders. Right? They too are largely irresponsible and not liable for anything that is done in their name. Nevertheless, historically, we know that the history of the state is a history of individuals. And we have forgotten to trace how the ownership of the political organization of the state has been transmitted through the ages. So it is not an easy matter practically to restore a sound libertarian, classical liberal principle of law to the corporations, but at least we should bring back in the notion of the owner as separate from managers and shareholders if you want to sort out the problems that arise in connection with the corporate world. And I think I will stop here.
Yes, I mean, as you've pointed out, Paul Marx, as you've pointed out, the corporate form in various ways, in various forms is ancient. One can point to university colleges, Peterhouse, Oriel and the others and say, we can call them a partnership of fellows if you want, but in all intents and purposes they were a corporation. And you can look in the modern period and say, well, the founders of the DuPont Corporation are long dead. There are a few DuPonts around, but there are no more owners. One thing I have noticed that you might want to comment on in my own short lifetime is the change in stock ownership. When I was born, the majority of stock was owned by individuals. So you could say, as Henson, I believe you said, well, the shareholders, they are the owners of the corporation in a sense. You would argue with that, but he makes the case. Now, the vast majority of corporations in the Anglo-American world, in the English-speaking world, which includes other countries, of course, the vast majority of stock is not owned by individuals. It is, in fact, owned by other corporations, pension funds, financial institutions. So it's very hard to actually trace any owners at all, even indirectly. Comment, please.
Yeah, well, the very idea of the corporation as an association of persons has today become so abstract because the notion of person involves both natural persons and corporate persons. Now, shareholders can be corporations, right? And as a result, a lot of the actions that are associated with corporations are no longer performed, like shareholding and other controlling functions. They are no longer controlled by individuals acting in their own names, but by individuals acting in the position of an agent of another corporation. So that is what I meant with the corporate culture and people sitting within positions. That is exactly what I meant. So, as it were, the natural person disappears from view. He's just a hired hand. Right? And of course, behind all these machinations and operations there are still powerful players. Because in the end, the strategic decisions have to be made not by corporations, but by individuals within corporations. So I'm very, I agree very much that the corporate world is not just individuals and corporations, but individuals in a network of corporations. An element that you mentioned and I had in my notes, but I didn't mention it in my presentation, is the question of corporate wealth. And for many people today, wealth and ownership is virtually restricted to papers, claims against corporate structures, either against the state, political corporations, or against pension funds or firms and so on, corporations. Now, that is part of the cultural problem with people who have no real sense of ownership as taking responsibility for how things happen and what happens with this and what happens with that. Just portfolio managers, and not even that. People who have such an abstract notion of property and ownership, then of course all the questions of responsibility, liability, giving accounts and so on appear to be losing their sense. It becomes a very abstract question of managing rather than being involved with genuine actions. So I think as for a culture of liberty, that sort of relationship is very bad.
Chris?
Actually, I was in the short, sorry. Professor Vanguard, I'd like to thank you for that speech. I agree with everything you said. My own dislike of limited liability corporations began as a vague disquiet, blossomed into prejudice, and is now ripening into argument, though you are many, many years in advance of me. What I would like to ask, though, is let us take for granted that limited liability corporations are not part of the natural order. How do you think that we can somehow reverse what's been done?
Break down of the democratic state, right, where responsibility goes in circles. Right? So it's the politicians' fault, and the politicians say, well, we're just doing what the electorate wants us to do, and the electorate, of course, is completely unknown quantity. Right? Because we all are bringing voting in absolute anonymity and secrecy. There's no element of moral responsibility, tangible moral responsibility involved in voting. Mm-hmm. You might as well throw the dice, and for all I care, a lot of people do that.
Yeah. That's why we voted for it.
Well,
it's our fault.
That sort of ritualization of procedure, where you think you are doing responsible thing by voting, whereas you are doing the absolutely irresponsible thing by voting. And the same happens with different coloring, perhaps, in the present stock market, where we think we are taking care of our future by investing in stocks and bonds and funds and this and that. But of course, what we do is decided by a handful of wolves who run in packs, because fund management it doesn't seem to be a very much creative thing. People follow one another, and where is the responsibility? No. But if we had done that, then you would have heard the complaints, people.
Okay, Ben.
And of course, I think I'm right in saying that J.S. Mill opposed the secret ballot for precisely that reason, the ballot being a trust, not an individual whim. Since, certainly I think Berlin Means, who wrote in the 1930s on separation of ownership and control through the white organisation man, there's been a huge amount of diffuse worry open sort of populist sort of misuse about corporations and their irresponsibility. The latest example, perhaps, is the flurry around the creation of an offence of corporate manslaughter in this country. I suspect, I'd be most grateful for your comments, that the development of administrative law, which to heart in his concept of law 1961, I think, Clarendon, still seemed a sort of alien, continental, funny thing, but which has now acquired a huge amount of prestige as judges have struck down a number of grossly authoritarian decisions on the part of the Labour government, and have struck them down on the basis of a developing administrative law. The increasing respect that administrative law, if that's not a contradiction of terms, has acquired in this country has actually cloaked the very important questions you're raising, because people think, oh well, there are these corporations, they all have their wonderful rule books which govern everybody within it. Responsibility and liability are duly assigned in appropriate measures between the corporation as a whole and its sometimes errant employees who will be properly punished. And over and above that, there is the wonderful developing administrative law which governs the corporations themselves through judicial review and so on. So I suspect everybody here would probably tend to agree that that's a blind alley, but I suspect it's a very attractive and increasingly attractive blind alley, and I suspect that's part of the problem.
Certainly, the old argument that the corporation is a person in its own right has been used and is increasingly used to say that the corporation itself should be criminally liable and should be liable for all the environmental damage and so on that it causes. But if you look at the corporation itself, of course, that is just a paper construct. And what you do when you hit the corporation itself is hit quite a number of people who have nothing to do with the decision. All the people who work for it, the creditors and so on, they all are people who are punished for what the corporation has done, because you do not go for the individuals who did the wrong, but you go for the deep pocket of the corporation and in fact of the liability insurers of the corporation. It's a lot of dispersing of personal responsibility that is going on under that thing.
A lawyer, and for a number of businessmen and traders who use them. And the reason that I am always consistently given for my clients wanting to have limited liability is because they so greatly fear being forced into bankruptcy or penury by some sort of ridiculous or spurious claim. Now, the limited liability company still, as we stand at the moment, does provide some sort of shield. It's not as foolproof as it once was, but it does provide some sort of shield. And there are therefore very good incentives and very understandable reasons for why anybody going into trade or business would want to shield themselves, particularly when they can be sued because one of their employees is a bit stressed out. They can be made bankrupt over this nonsense, or some sort of environmental gobbledygook. So I don't think we can blame merchants or traders for wanting to be able to get on with their business. So the question that Sean raised before is, how can we reverse this trend? Well, I'd like to see it reversed, but I think it's impossible to separate it from the question of the culture of liability and the ever-expanding scope of tort and also statutory offences. This is precisely what traders and businessmen and bankers and so on feel that they have to protect themselves from. Now, to this extent, I'm actually quite, in a perverse sort of way, I'm quite pleased about the corporate manslaughter legislation. Because one of the ways this might be reversed is by, in a sense, the greed and opportunism of the ruling classes might actually get hoisted by their own petard, because they will actually impose so many statutory liabilities on directors and shareholders that it will get to a stage where people make a market decision, make a cost
company. And since nobody is forced to have a company, nobody forces you to have a limited company, it's actually quite complicated to set one up, even in Britain. Nothing's to stop you trading unincorporated. It might well be that the ray of hope here is that the government just, we might even want to encourage this tactically for the government to effectively reduce the corporate veil to zero. And then it will make no difference whether you're incorporated or unincorporated, because it's still like having a computer and attaching to the internet but no firewall. It may well be that actually corporate management and other such disgraceful nonsense is a blessing in disguise.
Well, I agree that sabotage can work, of course, and the judo tactics can work also. But the problem, the first part of your answer, I think, touches on the fact that all of these questions, as they arise in practice, presuppose a setting of the modern state with its modern judicial system. And that creates a special environment with specific incentives to do and specific incentives not to do particular things. And that is, of course, at the theoretical level, you have to discount these, right? Because I'm not talking about the criticism of the judicial system. This is the corporate system.
Mm-hmm. Okay, we are running out of time. There are two more questions. Yeah, go ahead.
I'm going to have lost it, but I'll take up the front of the corporation because nobody else seems to have done. You mentioned limited liability, as though that is a distinctive feature.
Can you speak up? I can't hear over here.
You mentioned limited liability, as though that is a distinctive feature of the corporation. But of course, everybody has limited liability in the sense that their liabilities are limited by the extent of their assets. And the corporation is no different. It is liable up to the extent of its assets. And so the real concern seems to be the fact that it is unnatural. Now, I can understand why libertarians are troubled by that at some sort of instinctive level, because all corporations in the modern world are state creations, and we don't tend to like state creations. But I'd like to ask you this question. In practice, what injustices or harms do you feel are imposed or caused by the unnatural corporate person that differ from the harms or injustices that might be imposed by the natural non-corporate person in commercial and business dealings? Because I can't actually see it.
Well, the fact that you can hide, as it were, behind several corporations, which you can then use to reshuffle your debts and your liabilities, that is the fact that you can, as it were, be several persons at once rather than being just a natural person you are. That creates a strategic advantage that is not available to organizations that do not have the privilege of the corporate form. Now, I agree that, as I said, the problem of liability is overrated in discussions of the corporate form, precisely because it is not as persons that the problem arises. The corporate person is liable to the full extent of its assets, just as a natural person is liable to the full extent of its assets. The problem is that a natural person is a natural person, but one natural person can create an infinity of artificial persons to hide behind and then limit the assets of these artificial persons. And then by skillfully acting through one corporate persona rather than another, he can, as it were, manage the liabilities and the debts that he creates.
Yeah. Now, okay, go ahead. You're the last one.
Yes, I'm not sure it's a question, it's a statement. I'm somewhat surprised by the ease with which the corporation is regarded by libertarians presume no libertarian can have any problem with such an arrangement, regardless of size. Size seems to be completely irrelevant to me, to the libertarian analysis. You might have some other objection, but it's not a libertarian one. The only issue, it seems to me, that concerns libertarians is tort or dealing. If somebody who is not dealing voluntarily with this organization is affected by it, for example, its vehicle knocks you down in the street. That's the only issue that libertarians should have any concern about at all. And then it seems to me that no corporate veil should be of any value at all to the people behind it. So it seems to me we've got two completely distinctive positions here. One is where you're dealing with consent, contract, and voluntary interaction with which libertarians should be 100% content, regardless of size, regardless of secrecy, regardless of the degree to which there's a veil, or regardless of depth to which the organization is pyramided. On the other side, there's a completely different position, which is that veil is of absolutely no value to the individuals concerned when it is interacting legally with those who did not participate voluntarily. For example, a civil liability of some sort.
Well, as I said, you have to distinguish between contractual debts and non-contractual debts. And of course, to the extent that there is actual consensual interaction, then you can say, well, it's a matter of consent and that's it. But the notion of consent is not as simple as you make it appear. Certainly, we all consent to the state, yes or no, right? You can have an infinity of concepts of consent in which, on the one interpretation, nobody here consents to the state, and on the other interpretation of consent, everybody consents to the state. The same thing with contracts. A lot of activity of lawyers and judges is concerned with establishing whether there was consent or no consent. And certainly for liability in torts, the question of the limited liability corporation or the corporation stands. There is no, even if you disregard all questions of consensual relationships, the non-consensual relationships still establish a limit of liability which is different in quality than the liability of a natural person. That's the point.
Okay, we are running out of time. You can discuss further with Frank during the coffee break if you want so, because the clock orders us to go to the coffee break. I